Hello, I'm Pastor Chester Hitchcock, and today I'm going to be talking about profanity in the Bible. Many Christians today have made profanity and foul language one of the worst sins in the Bible. But do we find examples of profanity used by the writers of God's Word? James tells us that we can hurt people by our speech in James chapter 3 verses 1 through 12. However, he doesn't explicitly mention foul words. When the Bible does speak against using filthy or obscene language, it's usually within the context of how our words should be used to edify others instead of hurting them. For example, Ephesians chapter 4 verse 29 says, "Let no corrupt communication proceed out of your mouth, but what is good for necessary edification, that it may impart grace to the hearers." Ephesians chapter 5 verse 4 says, "Neither filthiness nor foolish talking nor coarse jesting, which is not fitting, but rather giving thanks." And Colossians chapter 3 verse 8 says, "But now you must also put off all of these, anger, wrath, malice, blasphemy, filthy language out of your mouth." End quote. In other words, instead of swearing, we should use language that is uplifting. Instead of profanity, we should focus on words that are loving. Unfortunately, Christians who put so much emphasis on the sins of swearing often tend to neglect the weightier portions of the law. Matthew chapter 23 verses 23 and 24 says, "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you have neglected the weightier matters of the law, justice and mercy and faith. Blind guides, you strain at gnats and swallow a camel." Therefore, notwithstanding the advice of choosing our words carefully, rather than loosely speaking words considered profane, as we read through the Bible, we don't see the emphasis on avoiding curse words as much as some would expect. But instead we find carefully placed examples where the Bible writers often used foul words to describe the foul practices of many who thought that they were living the righteous conservative ways of God. Here are a few examples. Now keep in mind that the original language is much more vivid than our modern day translations record the verses. In Ezekiel chapter 23 verse 20, the prophet compares Israel to a lusting woman. Here's how it reads in the New King James Version. Quote, "For she lusted for her paramours, whose flesh is like the flesh of donkeys and whose issue is like the issue of horses." But the original language is far more vivid and foul, because the prophet wasn't trying to hide his proclamation behind cloudy and confusing words. Here's what it says in the original. "For she longed for her lovers whose penises seemed as big as a donkey and whose flow of semen appeared to be as much as that of a horse." Can you imagine how foul that would sound if a preacher said it in church? And yet that is how the prophet said it to the people back then. The prophet Malachi, in Malachi chapter 2 verse 3, states that God will spread refuse on the face of the priests. Refuse is a dumbing down of what the prophet actually said to Israel. The word translated refuse is literally referring to the stomach content of their sacrificed animal. In other words, the bull vomit or bull puke. It also referred to the bowel content of the sacrificial animal. Are you ready? In other words, bullshit. Notice the rest of the verse. "The refuse of the solemn feasts, and one will take you away with it," or literally to it. At their solemn feasts, the priests offered bulls and heifers as solemn sacrifices. Again, the original language is quite vivid. Now, here is another example. Isaiah writes, "The Lord will lay bare their secret parts," Isaiah chapter 3 verse 17. Literally, the Lord will make naked your penis and your testicles. Isaiah chapter 47 verses 2 and 3 says, "Your nakedness will be uncovered, your shame will be exposed." The same vivid description is used here in the original language as was in the last verse. And then we have Isaiah 64 verse 6, where it says, "Your righteousness is like filthy rags." But the original says the filthy rags is menstrual rags. That was as vivid as saying today, in God's eyes, your good deeds or righteousness is like bloody tampons. In 1 Samuel chapter 20, verse 30, the epithet that Saul hurled at his son Jonathan is translated in the NIV as, "You son of a perverse and rebellious woman." The TEV translates it as, "You bastard." And the NJB translates it as, "You son of a rebellious slut." I will leave it to your imagination to a more contemporary translation. One might argue that this foul language was from Saul after he had turned away from God, and this is true. But the Bible not only records Saul's foul language after he turned from God, but also we have seen the foul language by God's own prophets to describe the foul behavior of God's people. In other words, some of the foul language used by the wicked was also used by the righteous to describe foul beliefs that many thought were righteous. Let me say that again and a little more slowly to get the point. Some of the foul language that was used by the wicked was also used by the righteous prophets to describe the foul beliefs that many people thought were righteous. Many thought that their good deeds and their righteous acts made them more acceptable in God's eyes. And so Isaiah 64 verse 6 vividly denies that by saying your good deeds in terms of making you suitable to God is like bloody tampons. Was it necessary for the prophet to be so crude? Well, it's in the Bible. Apparently the prophets must have thought so. Apparently, the religious opinions of the people back then were foul enough to merit foul condemnation. Or, as Malachi says, God will spread bull vomit or bullshit on the faces of the priests from the very sacrificial animals that they offer up to him as an act of worship. In Philippians chapter 3, verse 8, Paul uses a Greek word, skubalon, that is translated dung or rubbish or excrement in our contemporary translations, but the original Greek is fairly vulgar. Here Paul is saying, when I focused on my conservative righteousness rather than God's grace, I was greatly deceived about my standing with God. Now I count my own righteousness as nothing but a bunch of bullshit. He is including himself in the condemnation instead of just including those who were rejecting his focus on accepting those who they had believed in the past were unacceptable, namely, in those days, it was the Gentiles. Today, it would include the LGBTQ+ community. Another example is found in Galatians chapter 5, verse 12, where the Apostle Paul wished that his legalistic enemies would just go ahead and cut off their penises if they think that removing a little bit of foreskin was going to make them more acceptable to God. Now, of course, the more contemporary translators and versions of the Bible tone it down, but Paul didn't. He wanted to make a bold statement. He wanted to shock them by the truth. So instead of using the Greek word peritomi, which means cut around, as you would for circumcision, Paul uses the Greek word katatomi, which means to cut through. This is a pretty vulgar way of describing his enemies. In fact, he is even going further than suggesting that they castrate themselves or remove their testicles like a eunuch. Paul is telling them that if they think that circumcision is going to make them more righteous, if they think that removing a little bit of foreskin from their penis is going to make them more acceptable to God, just go ahead and cut off your whole penis and see how righteous that makes you. That's how Paul was speaking to them. There is no doubt that Paul was using quite vulgar and profane and foul language to describe the vulgar, profane, and foul religious views that they held. Now, while we're on this particular visual of foul language, let me share with you another similar biblical image that has been muted by modern-day translations. In Genesis chapter 24, verses 1 through 3, Abraham tells his oldest servant, quote, Please put your hand under my thigh, and I will make you swear by the Lord, the God of heaven and earth, that you will not take a wife for my son from the daughters of the Canaanites among whom I dwell. In Genesis chapter 47, verse 29, Jacob says the same thing to Joseph, quote, "Put your hand under my thigh and deal kindly and truly with me. Please do not bury me in Egypt." To put the hand under the thigh is a euphemism for take hold of my testicles and penis and swear to me a solemn oath. As foul as that might seem in our culture, it was customary in those days to swear an oath by holding something sacred in their hand. Much the way today we would take an oath by putting our hand on the Bible. And since in Old Testament times circumcision was a sacred mark of the covenant God made with Abraham, taking one's genitals in their hand to swear an oath was to make a solemn promise. Now, while there are many other examples, I will share one more from the book of Ezekiel. In Ezekiel chapter 21, verse 1, God tells his prophets to, quote, "speak against the holy places and prophesy against the land of Israel." And in verse 7, he says, quote, "And when they say to you, why are you sighing? You shall say to them, because of the news. When it comes, every heart will melt, your hands will become weak, your spirit will faint, your knees will be wet with urine." More vividly and accurately, the prophet is saying, you're going to piss your pants when you hear this news. But the translators tone it down. But the vulgar yet accurate pronouncement was intentional. And as we read through the Bible, we find that those whom God chooses to proclaim his word are not always doing so with sweet, gentle explanations, calmly showing people where they are wrong. The misinterpretations of God's word by those who claim to be religious leaders truly and rightly angered the prophets as well as the apostles. As for Jesus, we don't find any foul and obscene words from him. However, without a doubt, Jesus said some very harsh things that clearly offended those to whom he was speaking. He called the scribes and Pharisees such things as, you're blind guides. You are whitewashed tombs. You are a brood of vipers. You are hypocrites. Jesus went so far as to pick up a switch and run the money changers out of the temple. Clearly, even Jesus wasn't always sweet and mild and meek and gentle when it came to dealing with those who endangered others with their religious teachings that misrepresented a God of love, claiming that their conservative lifestyle was what God required. Sometimes pastors are expected to be politically correct, so kind and gentle and non-offensive that they must never seem upset or angry and must never use a foul word under any circumstances. But when we take a closer look at God's word, we find a different picture. While all Christians, including clergy, should avoid becoming loose-lipped and vulgar, there are times when the religious beliefs of some should be called out for the foul, vulgar, unchristlike views that they are. And I'm not suggesting that pastors should be quite as vivid in their sermons where children are present. Nevertheless, sometimes when adults are speaking with one another regarding the religious beliefs and opinions, it would not be unbiblical for God's spokesperson to properly, carefully, and very intentionally use foul words to describe the foul views that are upheld by some Christians. Many times those who present themselves as conservative and righteous are spewing beliefs that Bible writers would have called nothing but bullshit. Some things that are promoted on right-wing conservative radio and television programs as Christian is straight out of hell. It is bigoted, chauvinistic, judgmental bullshit wrapped up in pious words spoken from men wearing clergy robes surrounded by stained glass windows, much of which is motivated by right-wing politicians who get big dollars from lobbyists and large corporations. When these politicians gaslight evangelicals into thinking that they are on their side, theology becomes the work of the politicians instead of the work of those who actually studied theology. Sadly, many pastors hand their God-given duty over to the politicians with the hope of getting laws passed to Christianize America. Christianizing America by means of civil laws is not God's calling for his followings. Forced religion is not God's way. It is straight out of hell. And it's high time that authentic Christian leaders call this heresy and blasphemous technique for the foul, hell-bound bullpuke that it is. Will bold Christian leaders have to use foul language like the Bible characters did? Perhaps. Will they be rejected, persecuted, criticized, and shamed by those who claim to be right-wing conservative protectors of the law? Probably. But before you start opening up a dictionary of profanity to use as a Christian, ask yourself if you can honestly try to balance how those words are used. But no matter how careful you are when using them as the prophets and the apostles did, many will hear you use them will be shocked. Many will be offended. And that's the risk that the prophets and the apostles took for the sake of boldly standing against the religious right of their days. If you want to watch a video about how the word conservative became a good word among Christians when in fact Jesus was crucified for being too liberal, click on the link above or on the link at the end of the video. But if this particular video has been helpful to you, give me a thumbs up. And if you haven't subscribed to my channel yet, hit that subscribe button and ring the bell and choose all to make sure that you get a notification the next time that a video is produced. God bless. And I'll see you in the next video.